Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. This week in the Americas, we look at cartel threats against U.S. citizens in Mexico, continued clashes with FARC dissidents in Colombia, and a likely fabricated false flag plot in Venezuela as tensions with the U.S. rise. In Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, we look at France, where the Le Cornu government collapsed after just 14 hours, and at Russia, which has launched its largest attack of the war against Lviv. We also cover violent protests in Georgia, Syria's first parliamentary elections since the fall of the Assad regime, and a fragile ceasefire between Hamas and Israel that remains under strain. In Africa, we look at al-Shabaab's deadly prison raid in Somalia and growing unrest in Madagascar. Finally, in Asia-Pacific, we assess the junta's use of motorized paragliders to attack protesters in Myanmar, one of the deadliest assaults on civilians this year. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where banners attributed to a Sinaloa cartel faction have appeared in Mexico, threatening U.S. citizens and officials. On October 5th, two narcomantas, banners used by drug cartels to issue public messages, were found in the popular tourist destination of Los Cabos in Baja California Sur. According to local media, the messages allegedly threatened U.S. citizens and officials either visiting or living in Mexico, as well as senior Mexican and U.S. figures. Those named included Kash Patel, the current director of the FBI, Terry Cole, the administrator of the DEA, and Mexico's sitting president, Claudia Sheinbaum. The banners were reportedly signed by members linked to the Los Chapitos faction of the now fragmented Sinaloa cartel. They quickly circulated on social media. However, the mayor of San Jose del Cabo, Christian Agúndez Gómez, stated that local authorities had investigated the incident and concluded the banners were never actually placed. Now, our intelligence team's assessment: Mexican cartels have long used narcomantas as tools of intimidation, testing their intended audience and shaping public perception. While the authenticity and source of the recent banners remain unconfirmed, their appearance follows months of growing U.S. pressure on Mexico to curb cartel activity and the flow of narcotics across the border. This has included the designation of several Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, alongside expanded border enforcement and U.S. intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions over Mexican territory. There have also been threats to conduct drone strikes on Mexican soil. And more recently, the introduction of U.S. sanctions against a network of Mexican companies and their affiliates suspected of supplying precursor chemicals used to produce fentanyl for the Los Chapitos faction. Mexico, in turn, has carried out hundreds of arrests and extradited several key figures from within the Sinaloa cartel to the United States. Among them was the group's former leader, whose capture was widely viewed as a catalyst for the cartel's fragmentation and the resulting surge in factional violence. Together, these actions have significantly disrupted the Sinaloa cartel's operations. If the banners are genuinely linked to Los Chapitos, there is a realistic possibility that they're simply messaging and intimidation, rather than an immediate threat to tourists, given the Sinaloa cartel's financial stake in the tourist industry. If the threat is genuine, there are several courses of action Los Chapitos could pursue. Any direct threat to life would almost certainly provoke a major crackdown by Mexican security forces, a response the group would likely want to avoid, given its weakened position after months of fighting, arrests, sanctions, and internal fragmentation. More likely, they would favor tactics that exert pressure without inviting full-scale confrontation. Those could include extorting U.S.-linked businesses, intimidating staff and owners, carrying out short-duration or express kidnappings, committing acts of arson, and increasing violence directed at local officials rather than at tourists. Staying in the region, Colombia's security forces have intensified operations against FARC dissidents following clashes with the EMC faction. The Colombian military forces have intensified operations in the Amazon region of southern Colombia, targeting the killing or capture of FARC dissident leader Ivan, commander of the Estado Mayor Central, or EMC. Special forces have carried out a 5-day operation targeting an EMC camp in the Amazonas department. Mordisco managed to evade capture, but 4 of his bodyguards were killed during the assault. Several others were detained, and a cache of weapons was seized. Authorities have offered a reward of 5 billion pesos for information leading to Mordisco's capture. Now our assessment. Unlike most of FARC's senior leadership, Mordisco rejected the 2016 peace agreement and vowed to continue the armed struggle. He went on to unify several splinter factions under a new banner, the EMC, or Central General Staff. The EMC is now believed to be active in at least 16 of Colombia's 32 departments. It is widely suspected of involvement in illicit activities, including narcotics trafficking, extortion, and illegal mining. Among FARC's dissident groups, the EMC remains the most active and capable. Its attacks have intensified across Colombia since 2024, when the government suspended the bilateral ceasefire with the group in the departments of Nariño, Cauca, and Valle del Cauca. These attacks have continued to rise throughout 2025, largely in response to ongoing government offensives and the pursuit of Mordisco himself. Most EMC attacks are marked by the use of improvised explosive devices, ambushes on security patrols, coercive roadblocks, and kidnappings, activities that are largely confined to remote areas. However, in June 2025, the EMC carried out a series of at least 24 attacks targeting police stations and municipal buildings across the Cauca and Valle del Cauca departments. Many of these took place in urban or semi-urban areas, including in Cali, Colombia's third-largest city. These attacks were followed in August by a truck bomb detonated outside a military aviation school in Cali. The explosion killed 6 people and injured 60 others, all of them civilians. The EMC was later confirmed to be responsible for that attack as well. These attacks demonstrate the EMC's ability to operate beyond its traditional strongholds, striking in areas under government control. They also suggest a growing willingness to accept high civilian casualties in pursuit of the group's objectives. The timing of these incidents coincided with intensified government offensives and operations aimed at capturing Mordisco. In response, the EMC is likely to retaliate by escalating attacks in areas surrounding its main strongholds. Such reprisals could include strikes in major urban centers, such as Cali and Buenaventura, as well as other settlements within reach of EMC fronts and logistical corridors. Now moving on to Venezuela, where the government has claimed to foil a so-called false flag plot targeting the U.S. Embassy in Caracas, a move that may be more about tightening domestic control than counterterrorism. President Nicolás Maduro announced that security forces had disrupted a false flag plan to attack the U.S. Embassy, which has remained officially closed since 2019. The plot allegedly involved the use of improvised explosive devices at the embassy site by what Maduro described as extremist sectors of the local right. According to pro-regime sources, the plan was intended to heighten tensions with the United States and give the Trump administration a pretext for intervention. The claim comes amid a series of recent provocations between Washington and Caracas. These include the alleged detection of U.S. combat aircraft off Venezuela's coast on October 2nd, the Trump administration's October 3rd legal designation of its counter-narcotics campaign as a non-international armed conflict, and several U.S. strikes on suspected narcotics vessels in the Caribbean, which have killed at least 21 people since August. Tensions escalated further on October 8th, when the Trump administration announced it was suspending diplomatic negotiations with the Maduro government, following a meeting with senior Venezuelan military commanders. Now, our team's assessment. Caracas has provided no credible evidence to support its claims of a false flag plot targeting the U.S. Embassy. There is a realistic possibility that the regime fabricated the incident to justify heightened surveillance, stricter security measures, and the repression of opposition groups, while also seeking to control the narrative ahead of any potential U.S. action. This approach would allow the government to portray future developments as part of a broader U.S. effort to destabilize Venezuela, using that narrative to rally domestic support and legitimize tighter internal controls. In the coming period, the regime is likely to intensify its monitoring of foreign nationals and may increase the arbitrary detention of individuals or organizations with foreign links operating inside Venezuela. The Trump administration's decision to classify its current counter-narcotics campaign as a non-international armed conflict appears to serve several purposes. The terminology is likely intended to reassure domestic audiences that the campaign is not directed against Venezuela itself, but against transnational criminal organizations, including Venezuelan drug cartels, already designated as foreign terrorist groups. At the same time, the non-international armed conflict designation allows the United States to operate beyond the limits of domestic criminal law, granting broader authority to use lethal force. This legal framing has likely been used to justify the recent and controversial strikes on narcotics smuggling vessels departing from Venezuela. The United States has previously applied the non-international armed conflict designation in campaigns against non-state actors such as Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. However, its current force posture in the region appears far greater than what would typically be required for a limited counter-narcotics or even counter-terrorism operation. The deployed assets, including naval destroyers, amphibious assault ships, marines, and fighter jets, are likely intended to deter Venezuela from retaliating against U.S. strikes on narcotics smuggling activities. Yet, the scale of the deployment suggests it could also support broader objectives, such as seizing and securing key ports during the opening phase of a potential amphibious operation. Taken together with the recent suspension of diplomatic negotiations, this buildup is likely to pressure Venezuela into avoiding any direct military retaliation. The U.S. retains the capability to rapidly reinforce its forces in the region, further strengthening its deterrent posture. However, the non-international armed conflict designation may also serve as legal authorization for U.S. drone strikes on Venezuelan soil, an option reportedly being considered by U.S. military officials. The United States has previously used the framework to justify drone operations in several theaters without the consent or cooperation of the host country, including Pakistan, Yemen, and Libya. If the Trump administration were to adopt this approach in Venezuela, it would likely exceed Caracas's current threshold for escalation and would compel the Venezuelan government to respond. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East and Africa, where France's Le Cornu government collapsed after just 14 hours, deepening the country's ongoing political instability. On October 6th, French Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu, appointed only in September, announced that he would resign roughly 14 hours after unveiling his new government. His resignation, which came as a surprise to political observers, followed a strongly negative reaction from across the French political spectrum to his cabinet choices. Many viewed his appointees as too similar to those of the previous and equally unsuccessful government of former Prime Minister François Bayrou. Lecornu is the seventh Prime Minister to serve since President Emmanuel Macron was first elected in 2017, and his administration is the fourth to collapse since the last French parliamentary elections in 2024. After announcing his resignation, Lecornu has continued last-minute negotiations in an effort to reach an agreement on the 2026 budget. However, President Emmanuel Macron has said he will not, for the moment, call new elections. Instead, on October 8th, Macron announced that he would appoint a new prime minister within 48 hours. Now our assessment. The collapse of the Lecornu government is highly likely to deepen public dissatisfaction with the French administration and may trigger civil unrest led by the left-wing opposition. President Macron's decision to appoint a successor rather than call new National Assembly elections is also expected to heighten parliamentary resistance, particularly if the new Prime Minister is viewed as a continuity choice or a Macron loyalist unwilling to negotiate with the left. Conversely, selecting a centre-left candidate could alienate Macron's allies on the right, especially given the potential challenge such an appointment would pose to key policies, including the 2023 pension reform law. A prolonged continuation of France's political crisis would make new parliamentary elections increasingly likely. However, such elections may not produce a decisive outcome. Despite repeated government collapses, the overall balance of political support has remained largely unchanged since the last National Assembly vote. The right-wing populist National Rally continues to lead with an estimated 32 to 35% support. Yet its potential seat count remains constrained by the cordon sanitaire voting arrangement between the centre and the left, designed to keep National Rally candidates out of contested seats during runoff rounds. The left-wing coalition, the National Popular Front, follows with around 23 to 25%. Meanwhile, President Macron's centrist Ensemble alliance has fallen to roughly 15%, with much of its lost support shifting to the centre-right Republicans. After a recent split, the Republicans now oppose any alliance with the National Rally and remain aligned with the centrist bloc, together holding about 23 to 27% of the total vote. In effect, if elections were held today, the outcome would likely mirror that of 2024, producing three major blocs with little incentive or ability to cooperate. As in 2024, the key variable remains the possibility of a split within the National Popular Front. The centre-left socialists could break away from the populist left France unbowed to form a centrist coalition with Ensemble Republicans and various independent or regionalist MPS. However, such a move could prove politically damaging for the socialists, which would risk losing voters on its left flank to France unbowed. Overall, it is highly likely that this kind of electoral outcome would prolong France's current political instability and fuel further public unrest. Still in the region, Russia has launched its largest attack of the war against Lviv in western Ukraine. Overnight from October 5th to 6th, Russian forces launched their largest aerial assault on Ukraine's Lviv Oblast since the war began in 2014. In total, 53 missiles and 496 long-range attack drones or decoys were fired across Ukraine, with 140 drones and decoys, along with 23 cruise missiles targeting Lviv Oblast. At least 4 civilians were killed and 18 others injured. In the city of Lviv, both civilian and energy infrastructure were hit, leaving parts of the city without power. Among the targets struck were warehouses in the Sparrow Industrial Park, including one used to store goods for the Polish clothing company LPP Group. A company spokesperson said that only a small quantity of their products had been stored there, and the incident would not significantly affect there to serve the Ukrainian market. Now our intelligence assessment. Since the sharp escalation of Russian aerial attacks in May 2025, Russian forces have almost certainly intensified their strikes on western Ukraine. Earlier examples include large-scale attacks on Lutsk on July 9th and on Ivano-Frankivsk on July 20th. For much of the war, western Ukraine, particularly cities such as Lviv, Lutsk, and Ivano-Frankivsk, had been regarded as a relative safe haven from Russian long-range strikes. This perception made the region an attractive base for Western businesses and non-governmental organizations seeking to maintain or establish operations in Ukraine. Western Ukraine, which borders 4 NATO member states, serves as the main entry point and logistics hub for the delivery of lethal aid to Ukraine, particularly from Poland, located roughly 60 kilometers from Lviv. Lviv has also become the center of Ukraine's rapidly expanding defense industry, where a range of weapon systems, including long-range platforms capable of striking Russian territory, are being produced. By carrying out large-scale attacks in this region, the Kremlin is almost certainly attempting to undermine Western Ukraine's status as a relative sanctuary, raising the risk profile for foreign operations and aid efforts in the country. This latest strike, launched close to NATO territory, follows several previous incidents that have tested the alliance's resolve, including drone incursions into Poland, multiple airspace violations across Europe, and the targeting of Danish military assets in the Danish Straits. It was likely intended, at least in part, to signal the potential escalation risks of NATO's continued support for Ukraine. The targeting of critical national infrastructure, particularly energy infrastructure, has long been a core element of Russian strike doctrine. However, since 2022, such strikes have tended to intensify toward the end of each year. As the autumn Rasputitsa mud season begins in mid-October, followed by freezing winter conditions, the environment for ground offensives deteriorates sharply. This is almost certainly a key factor for Russian military planners who seek to maintain kinetic pressure on Ukraine even when opportunities for advances along the front lines are limited. By striking energy infrastructure ahead of winter, Russian forces can also affect civilian morale by depriving the population of heat and power. Given Ukraine's recent successes in its own long-range campaign against Russian energy infrastructure, particularly oil refineries, the Kremlin is likely to escalate its attacks on Ukrainian critical infrastructure as an act of retaliation during the winter of 2025 to 2026. Now, moving on to Georgia, where anti-government protests have escalated into violent clashes, with authorities accusing demonstrators of attempting a coup. On October 4th, between 7,000 and 20,000 anti-government protesters gathered outside the Parliament building in Tbilisi, coinciding with Georgia's local elections. Opera singer and protest organizer Pata Burchuladze addressed the rally, reading a declaration that proclaimed the gathering a national assembly and announced the start of a transitional period intended to ensure the peaceful assumption of power. A group of protesters then attempted to enter the presidential residence, the Orbeliani Palace, leading to clashes with security forces. Police used water cannon and tear gas as demonstrators tore down part of a security fence. Authorities reported that 21 security personnel were injured, while local media said 6 protesters were hurt and 5 people were detained at the scene. On October 5th and 6th, prosecutors charged 5 opposition figures with attempting to stage a coup. Prime Minister Irakli Kobakidze pledged to completely neutralize foreign agents, accusing them of instigating an effort to overthrow the constitutional order. He specifically blamed the EU ambassador, Paweł Huszyński, for involvement in the alleged plot. Now for our intelligence assessment. It is almost certain that the Georgian Dream government will use the recent unrest to justify a further crackdown on the already fragmented opposition. The anti-government and pro-European protest movement first escalated into large-scale nationwide demonstrations after the disputed election in late October 2024, and intensified further in November following the suspension of Georgia's EU accession process. Since then, small-scale protests have continued in Tbilisi on an almost daily basis. The October 4th demonstration was one of the largest and most violent in recent months. The remarks made by protest organizer Pata Burchuladze, which implicitly called for the government's removal, followed by the apparent attempt by a splinter group to storm the presidential palace, suggest that some elements within the opposition movement may now be prepared to pursue the government's ousting by force. Georgian Dream leaders and officials have already accused so-called foreign agents of supporting the unrest. It is highly likely that, following the events of October 4th, the risk of arbitrary detention, increased scrutiny, and bureaucratic obstacles for Western travelers, businesses, and organizations operating in Georgia will rise further. Small-scale protests are also expected to continue in Tbilisi, particularly around Rustaveli Avenue, where security forces are likely to respond with greater force than before. Given the fragmentation of the opposition, the breadth and intensity of the government's crackdown since late 2024, and the diminishing availability of political channels to challenge those in power, the radicalism of anti-government protesters is likely to continue increasing in the absence of other avenues for change. However, these same factors will probably limit the scale of future demonstrations compared with the major protests of late 2024. As the authorities have already shown a willingness to use significant force and impose severe punitive measures against organizers and participants. Now moving on to the Middle East, where in Syria the first parliamentary elections since the fall of Bashar al-Assad have strengthened the transitional government's control, but left many minorities unrepresented. On October 5th, Syria held its first parliamentary elections since the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad's regime. Citing widespread displacement, incomplete civil records, and ongoing security concerns, the transitional government led by President Ahmed al-Sharaa opted not to conduct a direct popular vote. Of the 210 seats in the People's Assembly of Syria, only 121 were scheduled for election. Voting was also postponed in several governorates, including the Kurdish-held North and Northeast, as well as the Druze majority province of Swaida. Instead of universal suffrage, the election was conducted through an indirect system using electoral colleges. Subcommittees selected members for local electoral colleges, which then chose from a list of pre-screened candidates. The stated aim was for 70% of lawmakers to be technocrats and academics, and 30% to be notable community figures. The resulting assembly was overwhelmingly Sunni Muslim and male, with only limited representation of Syria's major ethno-religious minorities. A spokesman for the Higher Electoral Committee acknowledged these significant shortcomings and said he believed President Sharaa would address them in his forthcoming appointment of 70 additional assembly members. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Although not a popular vote, the relatively peaceful conduct of the election will almost certainly be presented as a success by President Sharaa's transitional government. The limited violence was likely the result of strict security controls and the postponement of voting in regions where the transitional authorities do not yet exert full control. However, it is precisely in these areas that many of Syria's deepest divisions lie, posing significant challenges to the country's fragile post-Assad transition. Critics have argued that the electoral process was top-down and opaque, offering only the appearance of pluralism while allowing Sharaa to consolidate power. Even so, the elections mark a notable milestone in Syria's political transition, despite falling short of a genuine exercise in popular democracy. Sharaa's upcoming appointments are highly likely to become a key source of potential discontent. He faces several choices: to appoint genuinely popular representatives from Syria's minority groups, to select token figures unlikely to challenge his authority, or to fill the seats with loyalists who will offer no resistance to his agenda. In practice, however, Syria's new legislature holds only limited power to challenge the executive under the interim constitution. The People's Assembly can overturn presidential decrees only with a two-thirds majority. With one-third of parliamentary seats reserved for his own appointments, Sharaa is in a position to completely undermine the legislature's authority should he choose to fill those seats with loyalists. On one hand, the transitional government almost certainly requires broad executive powers to address Syria's many urgent challenges quickly and decisively. On the other hand, the exclusion of genuine representation and participation from the country's diverse ethno-religious groups and political movements is likely to fuel further instability. In the absence of meaningful institutional channels, there is a growing risk that some factions will turn to violence as a means of pursuing their political objectives. The status of the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, remains one of the central challenges for the transitional government. In the past week, low-level clashes involving small arms and mortars took place in Aleppo between SDF units and government-aligned forces before a truce was reported on October 7th. The US-brokered agreement reached in March, intended to eventually integrate the SDF into Syrian state institutions, particularly the military, remains fragile. US envoys met with SDF and transitional government representatives on October 6 to address ongoing disputes, including the future of the roughly 10,000 female Kurdish fighters from the Women's Protection Units whose inclusion in the Syrian military the Sharia government almost certainly opposes. The question of the Kurds' status, along with that of the Druze and other minority groups, is highly likely to remain a major obstacle to achieving lasting stability in Syria. Meanwhile, in Gaza, Hamas and Israel have agreed to a phased ceasefire deal, though divisions on both sides threaten its durability. On October 9th, US President Donald Trump announced that representatives from Hamas and Israel, working with mediators from Qatar, Turkey, and Egypt, had reached an agreement on a phased ceasefire plan. According to preliminary details, Hamas will release the 20 surviving Israeli hostages between October 9th and 13th. In return, the Israel Defense Forces will withdraw from roughly 70% of the Gaza Strip, currently under their control. Israel has also agreed to free an unspecified number of Palestinian prisoners as part of the exchange. However, the deal leaves several key issues unresolved, including whether Hamas will disarm, how and when the Palestinian Authority might return to govern Gaza, and how reconstruction of the territory will be managed. Now, our assessment. The ceasefire agreement largely fulfills one of Israel's key war objectives, the return of the hostages. However, it leaves unresolved the second declared goal, the destruction of Hamas as a military and political force in the Gaza Strip. Hardline factions within Prime Minister Netanyahu's government are likely to push for the ceasefire to be treated as temporary, maintaining strong military and political pressure on Hamas to secure further concessions. At the same time, the broadly positive public reaction to the ceasefire announcement within Israel is likely to shape Tel Aviv's immediate decision-making. For Hamas, the ceasefire likely reflects a compromise between its hardline, Gaza-based leadership and the political leaders based in Qatar, who have led the group's negotiation efforts throughout the war. By releasing the hostages, Hamas gives up its primary source of leverage. However, the decision was almost certainly driven by the calculation that easing Israeli pressure on Gaza City is critical to ensuring its immediate survival. The phased implementation of the ceasefire, which deviates from the original US-backed framework, along with Hamas's temporary retention of the bodies of deceased hostages, may allow the group to preserve some bargaining power in future negotiations. Ultimately, Hamas will likely face pressure to disarm as part of any lasting peace agreement. In the short term, its strategy will probably focus on limiting the scope of that disarmament while securing strong international security guarantees. Within the Gaza Strip, the ceasefire agreement with Israel is likely to generate internal tensions among Palestinian militant groups. Some hardline factions, including elements within Hamas itself, are expected to favor continuing a prolonged conflict rather than accepting disarmament. There is a realistic possibility that, if the ceasefire endures and advances beyond its initial phase, splinter groups could break away from Hamas and other factions currently involved in the fighting. Depending on their size, cohesion, and level of coordination, such groups could pose a serious threat to the stability and longevity of the peace deal. Moving on to Africa, where in Somalia, Al-Shabaab has stormed a major prison in Mogadishu in an attempted jailbreak, one of the most significant attacks in the capital this year. On October 4th, the insurgent group Al-Shabaab launched an assault on the Godka Jalao prison in Mogadishu, an underground facility that holds numerous Al-Shabaab fighters. The prison is situated near the presidential palace, within one of the most heavily fortified areas of the city. According to witness reports, the attack began with a suicide car bombing at the prison's main gate. after which several al-Shabaab fighters, dressed as Somali security personnel, entered the complex in an attempt to free detained militants. The truck used in the bombing was disguised as a National Intelligence and Security Agency vehicle. Security forces managed to repel the assault before it succeeded, killing all 7 attackers, according to government statements. Officials did not disclose how many security personnel were killed, though a private ambulance operator reported transporting around 25 people from the scene. The siege lasted for roughly 6 hours. In a statement, al-Shabaab said the operation was intended to free all the Muslim prisoners the apostates had been holding and torturing there, naming the attack as support for the oppressed. Now for our team's assessment. The assault occurred just hours after the Somali government lifted roadblocks from at least 50 roads across Mogadishu. Barriers that had been in place for more than a decade to protect key government sites, the decision to remove the roadblocks followed several months of relative calm, along with growing public pressure from residents who said the restrictions were disrupting traffic and local commerce. The timing of the attack was almost certainly deliberate, coinciding with the easing of security measures. It also carried the added effect of undermining the government's claims of counterinsurgency progress, made in light of recent territorial gains against al-Shabaab. Prison breaks are a common tactic among Salafi jihadist groups and form a central part of the Islamic State's breaking the walls strategy, coordinated campaigns targeting prisons to free captured fighters. In 2021, al-Shabaab carried out a major raid on the central prison in Bosaso, in Somalia's Puntland region, freeing at least 400 inmates. Imprisoned al-Shabaab members also staged uprisings in 2020 and again in 2024. Other jihadist organizations have launched similar operations, including the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, which attacked a prison in Syria in January 2022, and Islamic State West Africa Province, which stormed Kuje prison near Abuja in July the same year. Such assaults carry significant propaganda value. They enable jihadist groups to replenish their ranks, recover experienced members, and project an image of resilience and strength. At the same time, they humiliate state security forces and compel governments to divert resources toward heightened security measures, often fueling further instability and accelerating insurgent momentum. This attack marks the 22nd suicide bombing in Somalia this year, and the second significant incident involving the use of disguises. Earlier in the year, a suicide bomber dressed as a military recruit detonated explosives outside a Somali army camp, killing at least 13 people. Al-Shabaab has frequently used disguises as part of its operations, with militants posing as security personnel, civilians, or NGO workers to carry out suicide bombings. Tactically, this allows attackers to approach high-value or densely populated targets, such as recruitment centers or government facilities, without drawing suspicion. Beyond the tactical advantage, the use of disguises is also almost certainly intended to heighten the psychological impact of such attacks, fostering paranoia and eroding public trust in everyday interactions. Further, al-Shabaab attacks in Mogadishu are highly likely in the medium term, with Western nationals and international hotels almost certainly among the group's preferred targets. And in Madagascar, the president has appointed a military general as prime minister amid widening protests and calls for his resignation. On October 6th, Madagascar's President Andry Rajoelina appointed Army General Rufin Fortunat Zafisambo as Prime Minister. Zafisambo had previously served as Director of the Military Cabinet within the Prime Minister's office. The appointment followed ongoing protests led by the Gen Z Madagascar movement, which prompted Rajoelina to dissolve his government on September 29th and dismiss former Prime Minister Christian Nuntsai. Rajoelina defended his decision by stating that Madagascar needed a prime minister capable of restoring order and the people's trust. However, Gen Z Madagascar rejected the appointment, giving the president 48 hours to resign and declaring, "As long as Rajoelina remains in power, we will continue the struggle." Demonstrations have been ongoing across Madagascar's major cities since September 25th. According to United Nations figures, at least 22 people have been killed and more than 100 injured, though the true numbers are almost certainly higher. The government has disputed these estimates. Protests have been reported in several cities nationwide. Despite growing calls for his resignation, President Andry Rajoelina has refused to step down. In a speech shared on Facebook on October 3rd, he claimed that certain politicians were attempting to exploit the unrest to stage a coup. Gen Z protest organizers rejected his remarks and warned they would take all necessary measures if the president did not respond favorably to their demands within 24 hours. On the morning of October 4th, Rajoelina held consultations with unions from key government bodies and with business representatives affected by the looting on September 25th, seeking ways to resolve the crisis. Gen Z representatives declined to participate in the talks. On October 8th, after the government failed to meet protesters' demands, Gen Z Madagascar rejected President Rajoelina's offer of dialogue and declared a public strike. The Employees' Union of Jirama, the state-owned electricity and water company, announced its support for the strike. The following day, on October 9th, Rajoelina appealed for 1 year to resolve the ongoing power outages in the capital, pledging that if he failed to do so, he would resign. Now, our assessment: the appointment of General Zafisambo is highly likely to further inflame protests across Madagascar. Following the dissolution of parliament, demonstrators shifted their demands toward President Rajoelina's resignation. Opposition leaders have voiced their support for the protesters, with former President Marc Ravalomanana stating that Rajoelina doesn't listen and that Zafisambo's appointment won't make a difference, given his previous role within the government. There is a realistic possibility that Zafisambo's appointment will coincide with security forces adopting increasingly forceful tactics against demonstrators. This risk is heightened by the fact that Rajoelina's appointment of a new prime minister, his main attempt to calm unrest, has almost certainly failed to placate the Gen Z Madagascar movement. As a result, he is highly likely to resort to harsher crackdowns to prevent further mobilization. The general strike launched on October 8th, if it gains widespread support, will almost certainly trigger additional clashes between protesters and security forces in the days ahead. Madagascar's utility crisis has been worsened by drought conditions that have sharply reduced electricity generation, leading to widespread blackouts across Antananarivo and its surrounding suburbs. In response, the government has sought to address the problem by investing in a 105-megawatt thermal power plant intended to stabilize the national grid. On October 7th, a large convoy of generator components was moved along the RN2 highway, suggesting that the authorities are accelerating the project to show progress and ease public anger over the outages. However, these efforts are highly likely to be viewed as largely performative and insufficient. With the focus of the protest movement now centered on ending President Rajoelina's rule, such measures are unlikely to reduce the scale or intensity of the demonstrations. President Rajoelina's pledge to resign after 1 year, if he fails to resolve Antananarivo's electricity shortages, marks his first public indication of a possible concession. Notably, his commitment focuses solely on fixing power issues in the capital rather than across the entire country. Given that the largest demonstrations are concentrated in Antananarivo, successfully restoring power there could realistically help reduce the scale of unrest in the capital, even if protests continue in other cities. Finally, in Asia-Pacific, Myanmar's junta has killed at least 24 civilians during a Buddhist vigil, using motorized paragliders to drop bombs on protesters. On October 6th, at least 24 people were killed and 47 others injured in Chongyu Township, in Myanmar's central Sagaing region, during a candlelight vigil marking the Buddhist Thadingyut festival and protesting against military rule. The attack reportedly involved a motorized paraglider dropping 120mm mortar rounds onto the gathered crowd. Witnesses said the strike came in 2 waves. Amnesty International condemned the assault, noting that children were among the victims, and describing the use of motorized paragliders as a disturbing trend previously documented in the same area. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. After 4 years of civil war in Myanmar, an estimated 82,000 people have been killed and 3.2 million displaced. In the lead-up to a planned national election in late December 2025, junta forces have launched renewed counter-offensives against rebel groups, including a recent campaign in Karen State that has reportedly breached the defenses of forces led by the Karen National Liberation Army. The peaceful protest in Chongyu Township was held in opposition to the junta's policy of forced conscription and the forthcoming national election, which is widely regarded as a sham. Sagaing, already one of the most contested regions between junta and rebel forces, was also devastated by the 7.7 magnitude earthquake in March 2025, which killed thousands. The junta's use of motorized paragliders is almost certainly a relatively new but now firmly established tactic, technique, and procedure. Their growing use is likely driven by shortages of critical resources, particularly jet fuel, which have constrained the operation of Myanmar's limited fleet of conventional aircraft. A United Nations report published in September noted that paramotor attacks tend to be highly indiscriminate. However, in this instance, it is highly likely that the crowd in Chongyu was deliberately targeted as a means of deterring further unrest. Following severe manpower shortages, junta forces have suffered multiple defeats at the hands of rebel militias. The recent strict enforcement of conscription has likely enabled the military to launch new counter-offensives, but it will almost certainly continue to fuel public anger and resistance. While the junta's use of deadly force against peaceful anti-conscription demonstrations may temporarily deter further protests, it will almost certainly push more people to join the armed resistance. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solaceglobal.com. Thank you for listening.